Hi, welcome back to U.S. History for the start of a new section. Today we're going to begin with Kennedy and his administration and the election of 1960. Your learning targets today are to explain how Kennedy changes our foreign policy or kind of alters it from what Eisenhower was doing. We'll talk about the two big foreign policy events of the short Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then we'll discuss the Berlin Crisis and some other foreign policy events in the 1960s. So how is the United States looked at in 1960? Well, we're perceived as losing the Cold War at this point because Sputnik was launched and the Soviets are winning the space race. Supposedly there's a missile gap because the Soviet Union is developing long-range missiles. There's the U-2 incident, and the U-2 is a plane. It's a high-altitude surveillance plane, and it was shot down by a Soviet missile, so we were caught spying on the Soviet Union. And Cuba comes to us for support after its revolution, and we say no. So then they go to the Soviet Union, and Fidel Castro comes to power through a revolution in 1959 and aligns himself with a communist nation. So in the election of 1960, it's a big deal. We've got John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the young, brash guy from Massachusetts, and his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Kennedy is a war hero. He commanded a patrol boat in the South Pacific during World War II. He's well-liked, handsome, and charismatic, but at only 43 years old, a lot of people are wondering if he's too inexperienced. And also, he becomes our first Catholic president, and that worried some Americans because they felt that the Pope would hold sway over American policy at that point, because Kennedy would have to listen to him or would strongly be suggested to listen to his religious leader. They are facing Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge of the Republican Party. They're hoping to keep riding the popularity of the Eisenhower administration because Nixon is VP under Eisenhower. Basically, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so Kennedy wins the election by, it's very close, but he's the first president that has been born in the 1900s, and he talks about a new generation of Americans, as you can see here from his quote. And let me do my Kennedy impression. It's not going to be very good. I'm just going to do an impression of Kennedy. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Got that Massachusetts Boston accent going on. He begins to build up the nation's defenses because he complains of this missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Kennedy administration, people are enamored with this first family because they're so young. They're the first presidents in a long time to have kids, like actual school-aged kids running around the White House. And they describe it as Camelot. And there will be other great administrations that come along, but there will never be another Camelot again. And Kennedy organizes his administration by bringing in the best and the brightest. He brings in the guy from Harvard as his national security advisor. The president of Ford, Robert McNamara, comes in and becomes Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and he puts his 35-year-old brother in charge of the Justice Department, and he becomes the Attorney General, and they're they have a very close relationship. So how does he change foreign policy? He builds up our nation's defenses. Remember, Eisenhower was lots of nuclear weapons and almost no tactical response teams, and Kennedy changes that in his foreign policy. It's called flexible response. He wants to be prepared to drop nuclear weapons, but yet also fight conventional wars. And by conventional war, I mean basic, like war as you and I would know it. He also initiates programs to help the third world, or the places that are still lagging behind in development. He starts the Peace Corps, which celebrated their 50th anniversary here very recently. which provides technical, educational, and health assistance to developing countries. It's very successful. And he also tries to start the Alliance for Progress, which provided economic assistance to Latin American countries, and this is not very successful, and one of the reasons why the United States does not have a very good relationship with some of the Latin American countries today. Now we get to the Bay of Pigs invasion, and the Bay of Pigs is a place in Cuba. It's called Bahia de Cochinos. And President Eisenhower and the CIA, right before about a year, his last year in office, make a plan to overthrow this new communist dictator, Fidel Castro, in Cuba. And it would be made by Cuban exiles, so they have something to fight for. People who escaped Cuba, came back to the United States, then decided to go back, trained with weapons. So around 1,400 Cuban exiles land on the southern coast of Cuba at Bahia de Cochinos, and they find 25,000 Cuban soldiers, Soviet tanks, and aircraft are waiting for them. So they're captured, some are killed, and the Bay of Pigs is a huge disaster, and it happens under Kennedy's watch, but he still approved it, even though it was planned under the Eisenhower administration. It goes with Kennedy. Then we have the Cuban Missile Crisis that happens in Cuba. So spy planes over Cuba photograph these missile sites being built, and Cuba is only 90 miles away from U.S. land. And so the Navy, we have to decide what to do. We can go in and we can shoot down these missile sites, we can blow them all up, but then a few might get fired at us and hit American cities. It could basically hit anywhere in the United States, essentially, except maybe Washington. So these cities would only have a couple minutes leeway time if we spot them on radar to evacuate, and millions of people could be killed. So instead of going to war with the Soviet Union, Kennedy is very level-headed. He prepares a blockade, which means he puts ships around Cuba, and he does not allow any Soviet ship in with a missile on it. Khrushchev and Kennedy then secretly talk about removing the missiles. Khrushchev offers to remove the missiles if the U.S. secretly removes its missiles from Turkey, another country next to the Soviet Union, and pledges not to invade Cuba. So for 13 days, this could have been a nuclear World War III, but due to the level-headedness of the Kennedy administration, it is prevented. Here are the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The missiles are taken out of both countries. We avoid nuclear war. That red telephone you always see on the president's desk in movies, that is established, the hotline system. And in 1963, the Soviets and the United States and other countries signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, because we're just blowing up nuclear weapons all over the place, in the air, let it blow around the world. Who cares? It's kind of dangerous. So we limit nuclear testing to underground, and we don't allow them to blow up in the air anymore. And this is signed in 1963, pledging to not do nuclear test bans in the atmosphere anymore, limit it to underground. Then we have the Berlin crisis. Remember, Berlin is in the middle of East Germany, and West Berlin is a part of West Germany, even though it is in East Germany, if that's not confusing enough. So Khrushchev wants Kennedy to end its occupation of West Berlin and just give Berlin to East Germany, and Kennedy refuses. He says, this is what we agreed to, this is what we're going to do. And so East Berliners are finding ways to get into West Berlin, and then that means that they're free. They're a part of West Germany. They can then go to West Germany and escape the crappy living that is going on in East Germany. So Khrushchev builds the Berlin Wall, which is 110 miles of wall built around West Berlin. And this is to keep East Berlin citizens out of West Berlin. It works, and refugees are kept out of West Berlin. They're not allowed to escape there anymore. And Kennedy's response is he sends 1,500 troops to further occupy West Berlin. Here you can see some of the In some places it's just a wall, in others we have checkpoints with these guard towers and barbed wire, and this separates the cities of Berlin. And here are some actual pictures of it being constructed and some of the rather interesting graffiti that was painted on it while it was there. I actually have a little piece of it, supposedly piece of the Berlin Wall right here. That was a cool thing to collect in the late 80s, early 90s when it was falling down. So there you go, even got a little paint on it. So that's about it as far as Kennedy and foreign policy. Make sure you fill out your learning targets, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.